The Zoot Suit riots were not actually riots. No one died and nothing was being protested. They lasted from June 3rd to the 13th in the summer of 1943. The events or riots that took place during those days were the result of racial tensions, post-war life, and the long history of violence against the Mexican American community. Analyzing the events that resulted in a physical confrontation between white servicemen and white citizens against young Mexican American Zoot Suiters takes a look into the social and political environment that surrounded the Mexican American community in the 1940s. What is a Zoot Suiter? This was a term used to describe the Mexican American youth that wore a zoot suit. A zoot suit was an actual suit, one that featured narrow drainpipe trousers, jackets with deep cuffs, and a fancy vest. Usually accentuated with a long chain, hat, and collared shirt, this style distinguished the Mexican American youth that would come to be targeted. Zoot Suiters symbolized a racially and ethnically diverse youth culture. They were often referred to as pachucos and pachucas. Pachuco or pachuca is a term that came from a notorious group of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in El Paso, who were known to be involved with drugs and prostitution. Pachuquismo became a word that was associated with crime, violence, drugs, drinking, and gang life. While being a Zoot Suiter and Pachuco were often interchanged, not all Zoot Suiters were in gangs or even considered themselves to be Pachucos. However, to the public, the Mexican American youth were Pachucos, as they were seen as juvenile delinquents. Many saw the Zoot Suiters as a youth that was individualistic and very different from that of the previous generation. They were rebellious, as they were not only revolting against being American, but also against being Mexican. The police saw the youth as a problem, as the Mexican problem, that led them to patrol and target the barrios in Los Angeles. This mass hysteria and distrust of the Mexican American youth would develop into civil unrest by many white servicemen and white civilians, which led to the riots of 1943. Racial tensions between white servicemen and Zoot Suiters were at an all-time high in Los Angeles, especially as post-war time brought many servicemen north of Los Angeles, where military sites were in close proximity to Mexican barrios. As the number of servicemen who had returned home from the war grew increasingly, large numbers invaded the Mexican barrios. Often suffering from symptoms of their war experiences, many started altercations with civilians. While many white civilians were bothered by the acts of their servicemen, they chose to ignore the destruction. The residents of the Mexican neighborhoods, where most of the conflicts occurred, responded aggressively to white military men who bothered their community. The media heavily reported the altercations between Zoot Suiters who decided to defend their communities. In the weeks before the riots, Los Angelinos were fed stories of the delinquent Zoot Suiters that were attacking servicemen and creating havoc. Not only had tensions risen since the death of Jose Diaz in the Sleepy Lagoon murder case, in which many Mexican American youth were questioned and arrested throughout the trial, but there was a growing distrust and anger towards Mexican Americans, which resulted in servicemen and civilians banding together to take care of the Zoot Suit problem. On June 3rd, 1943, the white hostility was finally ready to take care of the hoodlums. It began with the off-duty policemen staging a hunt for Zoot Suiters who had allegedly attacked 11 sailors entering the Mexican district. While the culprits were not found, the following night, 200 sailors hired a fleet of taxicabs and cruised through the Mexican district, stopping to beat any lone Zoot Suiters and ripping their clothing. The police closely followed and arrested the victims. This violence continued for days. Riots broke out as civilians and servicemen from all over the county attacked anyone wearing a Zoot Suit. An article in the Los Angeles Times claims that thousands of servicemen, joined by thousands of civilians, went on to look for or hunt down the Zoot Suiters. According to the text, the commotion and crowds were so large that the chief of police declared this a riot and called all of his forces on duty. The article then goes on to explain that more than 50 Zoot Suiters had their clothing torn from their bodies. The servicemen and civilians were said to have gone to bars, restaurants, stores, everywhere in the downtown area, searching for youth wearing the Rio pleats. The article even mentions Zoot Suiters being fined or jailed for pleading guilty to vagrancy. So while the servicemen and civilians were being investigated, the Zoot Suiters were the only ones to actually serve time in jail. The actions by servicemen and civilians only served as evidence of violence and racism against the Mexican American community. The white majority continued to see the Mexican community as foreigners and as the minority problem, while no punishment occurred to them. These acts of violence and racial divide would go on for decades to come. They shaped the start for a call of the Chicano movement, a call against injustice. The Zoot Suit riots are in part another act of white systematic racism and violence against Mexican Americans, and their treatment as second-class citizens in a country that would never accept them as their own.